This is part two of the lecture two. So, in this part two, we're going to talk about carbohydrates and bioenergetics, and also digestion and absorption of carbohydrates. So here we go. What activities need carbohydrates? Right, if you see at the bottom, it's in bold and underlined. All activities need carbohydrate for optimum performance. Like I said, optimal carbohydrate is not an essential. It's not an essential nutrient, but it does optimize human performance. And so, whatever activities you're engaging in, it will optimize. But I've listed a few different types of activities. There are different ways of calling activities and naming things and all the things. You read different books and they call these things a little differently. But for the sake of this class, here's what we'll do. Okay, I think this will probably make things a little easier from sport nutrition standpoint without having a extensive exercise physiology background because I realize exercise physiology is not a prerequisite to this class. But anyway, we have brief anaerobic activities. Okay, these are activities that last 10 to 30 seconds with a near max to max effort and near full to full recovery when repeated. So, um, I'll give you an example a little later. But basically, that lasts 10 to 30 seconds, all that. And then you have long aerobic activities. These are activities that last longer than 4 minutes, but less than 10 minutes. Okay, 4 minutes and less than 10 minutes. Okay, why 4 and why 10? These things have to do with um, the way that our energy systems work, and so just keep that in mind. Just don't think about it until you get to exercise physiology, and you'll probably find out why. And also, it's in a small letter. I don't know. I'm not sure why it came out to be small. But long slow aerobic activities is also there as well. These are the activities that last longer than 10 minutes. And you have mixed activities. These are the ones that last 30 seconds to 4 minutes with a near max to max effort and near full to full recovery when repeated. Now, when I say maximum effort means that, let's say if that's a case of sprinting, the last 10 to 30 seconds, you are sprinting as fast as possible. Okay, if it's a case of throwing, you're throwing it as hard as possible. Okay, you are given full exertion at all moment. Okay, um, in the case of long aerobic and in long slow aerobic activities, they don't really say near max to max effort. This is because in these activities you basically maintain sub-max effort, sub-maximal effort. Okay, the idea is to maintain. Okay, in other activities, the idea is to exert yourself to the maximum extent. Okay, so that you can be the first. Okay. Um, Going back to mixed activities, the closer it is to 30 seconds, the more anaerobic. Okay, the closer it is to 4 minutes, the more aerobic. But more anaerobic than long aerobic activities. And you have repeated anaerobic activities. These are special activities and special cases that consist of repeated, very brief to brief anaerobic activities. So we talked about activities that rely primarily on phosphocreatine and creatine in the previous lecture, the lecture one. And the very first one on this slide, brief anaerobic activities, are also a are there included in this when they are repeated. Okay, so they're like you repeat, you sprint, rest, but you do it repeatedly, and then the rest is very short. Um, and in fact, for optimal performance, you need carbohydrates for all. So here are examples. I didn't list examples in the previous slide because there's just not enough space. So for brief anaerobic activities, 20-meter sprint would be a good example. For long anaerobic activities, middle distance running like 1500 meters. Okay. Long slow aerobic activities, marathon, triathlon, Tour de France. Mixed activities, 400 800 meter sprints. Repeated aerobic activities. These are usually what people call team sports. So soccer, basketball, all these things. Okay. Usually, when people refer to when people talk about repeated aerobic activities, they're talking about teams. So the process that our body basically uses to extract energy out of carbohydrate is called glycolysis. Okay. Um, this basically, the word itself basically means to break down glucose. Okay. If if it's breaking down glycogen, then it's glycogenolysis. Okay. If it's glucose, then it's glycolysis. Okay. Like very similar to creatine phosphate. You can break down glucose into a certain form of chemical. In the process, you can extract ATP. Okay, and um, there are two different types basically of a glycolysis, and one's called a fast glycolysis anaerobic. The other one's called slow glycolysis aerobic. Okay, fast glycolysis or anaerobic glycolysis basically uses oxygen. Does not use oxygen. Okay. Now, when it does not use oxygen, it can provide ATP at a really fast rate, but it can go only for a very short period of time. That's a little longer than a PCR system, ATP PCR system. But it just cannot provide a lot of ATP just because it can only go for so long. Okay, so it's fast, um, and it does not use oxygen, so it kind of makes sense. Fast glycolysis in parentheses anaerobic. On the other hand, if slow glycolysis, this is slow, and it uses oxygen, so the ATP production is slow, and it uses oxygen, but it can provide a lot of oxygen. Okay, and as far as a energy system goes, the limit is basically determined by the amount of glycogen and glucose available to the cells. And so, as long as there is a glycogen or glucose, this slow glycolysis can keep going. On the other hand, a fast glycolysis can't. Okay, regardless of what there is, uh, it can only go for so long per bout of an activity. So, anything longer than a minute, usually 30 seconds is probably uh, as far as is a good length to conceive, but it can't really go any longer than probably like 1 or 2 minutes. And if it goes any longer, you're barely using a fast glycolysis. So just to show you anaerobic glycolysis, and this is also part of aerobic glycolysis. But when it's anaerobic glycolysis, there are more things that happen after this anaerobic glycolysis. So you can see there's muscle glycogen at the top in a blue box. It goes to glucose. It gets converted to glucose and it goes through glycolysis, and then it goes. It becomes a pyruvic acid. Okay. This eventually becomes pyruvate if you have oxygen and if it's anaerobic glycolysis. But if not, then it becomes lactic acid. Okay, I think you have heard of this before. This is the guy that burns your legs and all your muscles. You know, the burning that you feel when you exercise sometimes. It's because of this reason. So you know that if you are burning a lot, you're using a lot of you're basically engaging anaerobic glycolysis to a really great extent. Okay, but because of this lactic acid and a few other things, it can only go for so long because when you start accumulating a lot of lactic acid, uh, basically the acid itself and a few other things start to slow down the anaerobic glycolysis, and eventually you'll stop it. And so you can only go for so long. But if it's aerobic glycolysis, the production of lactic acid is very minimal, and you will not interfere with the ATP production. What interferes uh, is the lack of glycogen or glucose. So aerobic glycolysis. So you probably have heard of a Krebs cycle. I hope you have. So there's a Krebs cycle, and after Krebs cycle, it goes to electron transport chain, all these things, and this is not phys. I'm not gonna talk all about this, but eventually you produce a lot more ATP that way. But you need oxygen, and this is slow. So importance of carbohydrate. Carbohydrate is very important. One reason is it's a very efficient source of energy. Okay, that's the second most efficient next to phosphocreatine. So if you look at the table at the bottom, you see on the left most column, you say PCR breakdown, glycolysis, glycogen oxidation, glucose oxidation from blood, and fat oxidation. And in the middle column, they say it's maximum rate of ATP resynthesis. So this basically tells you that the greater the number is, the faster that energy system is in reproducing ATP, okay, replenishing ATP. So it's kind of ranked in that order. So PCR breakdown is by far the fastest. Okay, it's about twice faster than glycolysis. And you see the glycolysis. This is the fast glycolysis. It's the second fastest. And when you use oxygen to um, a breakdown glucose or glycogen, it's much slower. Okay, so this is the glycogen oxidation and glucose oxidation. And when you use fat to produce ATP, which you can also do, the rate is even slowest. So it's the slowest. Okay. You can see on the right, delay time. PCR breakdown is instantaneous. It's the very person that kicks in that moment. Okay. Fast glycolysis is about 5 to 10 seconds after the initiation of exercise. Glycogen oxidation is about 1 to 3 minutes. Okay. Glucose oxidation is about 90 minutes. The reason being is because you have actually glycogen in your muscles. But these 90 minutes and also 2 hours below are kind of like a ballpark. And it can be a little earlier, but the point is that the PCR, ATP PCR system and fast glycolysis are the two fastest ones. And so an increase in intensity generally results in greater use of carbohydrates. So the intensity, if you have not taken exercise before, is defined as, let's say for the sake of this class, if it's a sport that involves moving, I guess many sports do, then it's the speed. Okay, so whether it's marathon or sprinting or change directions, football, soccer, whatever, the faster you run, the higher the intensity is. Okay. Also, in the case of if it's something to do with weightlifting, like you actually move implements of different weights, then it's the amount of weight that determines the intensity. It's not the number of repetitions. I know if you do more reps with certain weight, it's gonna be hard, it's gonna burn a lot, but that's not what the intensity means. The intensity has nothing to do with how many times you do, how much you do. It has to do with the rate of movement, or I guess the rate of loading in that case, in the case of weightlifting. Okay. So if you're thinking of your own sports, I don't know what you do, but many people usually play a football or soccer, or you like jogging or whatever. So you can think of intensity in your sport as running speed or movement speed. So glycogen, you have muscle glycogen, and that's readily available, okay, for working muscles, because we have this within the muscle. It's right there within the muscle. It's like sitting, okay. And when we need it, you can just break it down and take out whatever you need and use it to produce energy. And so when you are out of muscle glycogen, that causes a lot of fatigue. And in some sports, this is a major problem. Okay, and so it's very important. Low levels of muscle glycogen also decrease protein synthesis. Okay, this basically means so is that you are optimizing recovery. You are, I'm sorry, not optimizing recovery and training adaptations if you just leave it low. Okay, so you need to actually um, reestablish the muscle glycogen level if you actually want to get better. If you want to get some out of your training that you do, whether it's running or lifting weights, whatever practice that you do, you need to replenish muscle glycogen. If you want to recover from a game, race, whatever, you also need to replenish your muscle glycogen. So it's very important. Now, in terms of recovering and adaptations, I have a section of the semester in the entire section in the semester that's devoted to that, and we'll discuss more about this. Now, this lecture 1, is geared specifically towards providing energy to perform. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on. But just for the future reference, just remember that protein synthesis means recovery and adaptations. It's not just getting your muscles bigger. Okay, it's about everything. Because humans actually are made of proteins and amino acids. Actually. And so low carbohydrate diets also results in low muscle glycogen levels. So you need to eat some carbohydrate. If you don't, you're not gonna have a lot of muscle glycogen. So that's that. And then liver glycogen is used to maintain a blood glucose level for the brain. Okay, so that's very important. You can actually deplete a liver glycogen in probably 12 hours. Okay, just sleeping through a night can markedly reduce the liver glycogen, and so that's why you should have some kind of carbohydrates in the morning for the breakfast. Okay, and as it goes down, your brain performance goes down, and guess what? Your technique goes down in a certain sport, your coordinations, your attentions, your cognitive abilities, all these things actually go down. So, uh, if not the muscle glycogen that you want to replenish, even well, even if your muscle glycogen is full, you need to do something about your liver glycogen. So, there are times where you should eat a carbohydrate of some amount, okay, and then that probably happens quite often. So here's just an example. Okay, so you have a table here. At the top it says muscle glycogen concentration. On the leftmost column it says high carbohydrate diet and a normal diet. In the subsequent column in the upper row it says before halftime and the end. So this is a soccer performance. Okay, so they measured muscle glycogen before a soccer game, at halftime, and after a soccer game. Okay, so you can see if you are on high carbohydrate diet, you have more glycogen before you start, you have more glycogen at halftime, and you're down to really low amount of glycogen, but you still have a little bit higher glycogen at the end than normal diet. Okay, and so if you compare, these two diets, and maybe relate the effect of muscle glycogen to the performance, and you can easily see that the players that were on a high carbohydrate diet were able to cover more distance, okay, and were able to spend more time on sprinting and less time on walking. So that is a very good thing, right? I mean, you had more energy, you were able to run around and do all kinds of stuff. So that's what a carbohydrate could do. Okay. Before we move on to any of the recommendations and all these things, I'm going to talk briefly about digestion and absorption of carbohydrate because this is very important. You have to kind of understand this. Otherwise, we can't time it well. Um, can't know what to eat and all that stuff. So here we go. Some general digestive process. So digestion is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So you can't really tell your your stomach to start doing things, and you know, your small intestine to start observing things. It just happens automatically in response to the chemical signals that a that food provides by binding to receptors within your mouth and tongue and different parts of the digestive tract. So digestion basically hydrolyzes complex molecules into simpler substances for absorption. Hydrolyze means to split, and you probably have seen this in the other parts, but that's what it means. Um, Self-regulating processes within the digestive tract largely control the liquidity, mixing, and transit time of the digestive mixture. As far as carbohydrate digestion or absorption, the goal of carbohydrate digestion is to break a carbohydrate down to monosaccharides. Okay, that's what we all about. Okay, so we talked about disaccharides, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. But at the end of the day, they all need to be broken down to monosaccharides because that's just the only way that our the digestive tract can absorb. So salivary amylase degrades starch to simpler disaccharides. Okay, um, and then pancreatic amylase continues the breakdown, but the major digestion occurs in the brush border of the small intestine. So we have enzymes, and then we do have others, but we have enzymes called maltase, sucrase, and lactase. Okay, anything that ends with ACE, ASE, are enzymes. So these guys, digest, breakdown, or hydrolyze different different saccharides, disaccharides, oligosaccharides, polysaccharides, and all these things um, into a monosaccharides. And the key thing to note here is glucose and galactose are observed much faster than a fructose. Okay, I should have put a fructose there. We talked about three monosaccharides. Okay, glucose, galactose are observed much faster than fructose. Okay, this is very important because sometimes we want these carbohydrates to get to the cells as soon as possible. So here's a little picture that might help you kind of understand this digestion process. So you can kind of see on the left, right, okay, well, we have a human body on the far left, right? And then on the right of that, is at the top it says where, so it says mouth, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and basically it tells you what happens in each component of the digestive tract. Okay, on the far left you see the product of the process of each component, and in the middle you see the entity that actually is involved with digestion, and you see the digestive chemical or enzymes on the right side of that. So you see at the end on small intestine, you get a bunch of monosaccharides. Okay, so like fructose and galactose and glucose, and then at the end of a large intestine, you get like fiber, fatty acids from fiber through the bacteria fermentation, bacteria processes, and some of the gases and all that stuff. All right, another concept very important in digestion, absorption, and carbohydrate is glycemic index, and some of you are very familiar with this. Um, but glycemic index basically is an index of how fast the body absorbs certain food, okay, or that contains carbohydrate into the bloodstream. Okay, so the speed of the absorption. Okay, that's basically what it indicates. Um, Again, this is very important thing to know because sometimes you want a very fast absorption. Sometimes you don't need very fast absorption. Okay, so it really depends on what you want. But knowing what food has high GI can help you in terms of planning your meals for important times over your training, recovery, and performance competition. Um, if two other things to know regarding glycemic index at the bottom, fiber can reduce GI. Okay, so you eat something that's high in GI along with a bunch of fiber, it actually slows down the absorption of small intestine, as well as slowing down the gastric emptying rate. Okay, um, so that's something you want maybe at times, but that's something you don't necessarily want at other times. Okay. Then you have protein and fat. These also slow down the gastric emptying rate. Okay, so even if you eat something that's high in GI because you want it to the cells right away, if you eat it with protein or fat, it will slow down the gastric emptying rate, and you may not get the carbohydrate nutrient to the cells as fast as you want it. And then you have glycemic load. If you have never heard of this before, this is kind of a new concept. Um, this is basically the amount of carbohydrate that appears in the blood uh, in relation to glycemic index. So not only the rate, but you will also want to know how much, right? Because if you drink just tiny bit of a Gatorade that is high in glycemic index, you will have a really high GI, and that's great. But if the amount is not sufficient, maybe you only end up delivering 5 grams of glucose. Then that just doesn't make much difference. Okay, so you are also concerned with the amount, how much. Okay, the GL, the glycemic load, basically tells you that. Okay, uh, to calculate GI and I'm sorry, GL. Sorry, the GI, by the way, is something that you just cannot calculate. Or you can calculate, but you have to measure something first, and then you make a calculation. But GL is something that you can calculate if you know a GI of that food. Okay, the GI of that food. So you take the grams of carbohydrate in one serving and divide and multiply that by GI of the food and divide that by 100. So for example, if you have one serving of watermelon um, has 6 grams of carbohydrate, then and then the glycemic index of watermelon is 72. You multiply 6 by 72 and divide that by 100 and you get 4.32. Okay, that's really not a lot. That's really low. Okay, think about how many grams of carbohydrates are in this watermelon. Out of 120 grams, there's only 6 grams. There's just not much carbohydrate. So here's just a table of different foods that contain carbohydrates or I guess that are high in carbohydrates. And you can see GI and GL and all these things. And so this is kind of a neat table that outlines what's high, what's low. Um, surprisingly, M&M, the peanuts, the peanut M&Ms. I don't know if that's your favorite. Has low GI. Honey, very sweet, but honey is low in GI. Potato chips is barely low in GI, but it's still low in GI. And you can see, look down the bottom, right at the bottom, fructose is really low in GI. Okay, so it's slow in delivery. Okay. Peanuts, low in GI, grapes, peach. You can see that for the most part, the fruits are low in GI because, again, they contain fibers, but also their primary carbohydrate is fructose. So that's not surprising that they're low in GI. Anything else? Milk, spaghetti, Actually, noodles are usually low in GI. Beans, uh, what else? Um, Pizza, yes, it's low in GI. Why? Because it contains a lot of fat also. Um, Sweet corn, wheat bread, carrots. Carrots don't really have much carbohydrates, but they're low in GI too. So all bran cereal, there you go. So all these things, supposedly healthy things, they're low in GI. So hypoglycemia is just another thing that you should know because you might have experienced this or you might experience this in the future. So hypoglycemia is defined as lowering your blood glucose below the critical level of 3 millimoles per liter. Now you will not die from hypoglycemia because, like I said, you can live without glucose, but because you all of a sudden you get a drop of glucose and your body's not used to it. You get dizziness, nausea, cold sweat, reduced mental alertness, ability to concentrate, loss of motor skill, increased heart rate, excessive hunger, and disorientation. Okay? And this can occur during physical activities as a result of physical activities because you keep working hard and without eating or drinking anything, and so you run out of muscle glycogen, you run out of liver glycogen, and all of a sudden you're like, boom, down. Okay, no glucose in your blood, and you get hypoglycemia. But what's more important about sport nutrition and sports performance is reactive hypoglycemia. Okay, this occurs as a result of two things. One, you eat a food that's high in a glycemic index. Okay, and so because it's high in glycemic index, you get a quick delivery of glucose in the blood. So you get a lot of glucose in the blood all of a sudden. And then you start exercising. What happens is that when the body detects a lot of glucose in the blood, it starts to secrete a hormone called insulin. Okay, this insulin basically tells all the cells within our body to start taking glucose from the blood into themselves, okay, so they can clear the glucose within the blood. Okay. And also, exercise is a strong stimulator of blood glucose uptake. Okay, so your muscle cells, for example, can take up glucose without the effect of insulin. Okay, so now you have two stimuli, right? Insulin and exercise that tell muscle cells to observe, take in, suck up a glucose. Okay, so when there are two of them going, your muscles all of a sudden gear up and just taking as much glucose as possible, as fast as possible. And when this happens, your body cannot keep up with the glucose production into the blood, and you get a really fast, a quick drop of blood glucose level, and you get basically the same symptoms and signs we saw in the previous slide. And so you need to plan your meals. One reason is you need to plan your meals, what to eat, when to eat, all these things, so you can avoid reactive hypoglycemia. When you exercise, when you train, etc. Also, gastric emptying rate is something that's important. We talked about how fiber might affect, protein might affect, fat might affect. But if you want a fast delivery of carbohydrate to the cells, you want to consume something that gives you the highest gastric emptying rate. Okay, carbohydrate that gives you fastest gastric emptying rate, as well as highest absorption. Okay. There are some factors that actually affect the gastric emptying rate. Okay. If you plan these things better, you can reduce discomfort, gastrointestinal discomfort during exercise, and you can plan, nutrient delivery to the cells. Usually, gastric emptying takes anywhere from 1 to 4 hours, but if it's a typical meal that contains carbohydrates, some kind of fat, and a protein, and vegetables, it takes about 3 to 4 hours, more like 4 hours. Okay. So if you have read any guidelines of many small meals a day, instead of like having only 2 meals or 3 meals as a better guideline to lose weight. They recommend like 3 to 4 hours, every 3 to 4 hours, eat something. That's one of the reasons is because of this. Um, but anyway, that's how long it takes. But some carbohydrates can get out of a stomach and get absorbed into the bloodstream in 15 to 30 minutes, usually more like 30 minutes. Um, but some can do that. Something like a Gatorade or pure glucose. So what are the important factors affecting gastric emptying rate? We have volume of the food ingested, energy density, macronutrient composition, solid or liquid, meal or beverage temperature, psychological stress, and others. And let's look at each one of these things. So volume of ingested food. So the more volume you have uh, of food sitting in your stomach, the faster the gastric emptying rate is. Okay, so if you eat something that contains high amount of water soluble fiber and drink a lot of water, then it expands in your stomach. By doing so, it actually distend distends the wall of the stomach, and that sends signal, um, and then your stomach starts to work hard, and starts to empty at a faster rate. Okay, but as you realize, if it empties more, as it empties more and more, the volume gets less and less. So the rate of emptying goes down and down and down. Now, from the standpoint of application of this to the sport, you may not see the benefit because I don't think anybody really wants to be full when they're exercising or before they exercise. So this may not be much of a concern for during exercise or right before the exercise, but just something for you to know. And then you have energy density. This is probably a the primary factor. Is that it's not the volume is also important, but it's the caloric density that's even more important. So you eat something that's small in amount, but very very dense in calories. What your stomach does is that because it's so dense in calories that it actually holds that food in the stomach for a longer period of time, so it slows down. Okay, for that reason, because fat per gram is higher in calories compared to any other nutrients, is a strong inhibitor of gastric emptying as well. Okay, so you can maybe drink the same amount of water versus the same amount of maybe like a chocolate milk. Um, then your stomach empties water faster than the chocolate milk. By the way, when I say empty and digest, it's not like your food is constantly sitting there all the time. It's emptying rate slows down so that it becomes more and more titrated. Okay, it's not like there's nothing that comes out of the stomach for 3 4 hours. There's something that keeps coming out, but it's just little by little. And then the more a calorie dense the meal was, the slower that titration is. And then solid versus liquid. Generally, liquid seems to be emptied faster, but this might be the result of like the volume, energy density, macronutrient, and all these things. And so it's not always fair to compare liquid to solid. Okay, but there are some a nutrient supplements available like carbohydrate gel, which is basically a liquid or solid, or some kind of Gatorade, uh, water, Gatorade liquid. Um, the drink, which is basically liquid. When you compare those things, and they're exactly the same in the composition, the only difference is the form. It's a solid or liquid. The effect seems to be very similar, at least as far as I can tell, the gastric emptying rate does not seem to be different between the two. Okay, so for the sport nutrition purposes, when you have something like that special, it may not make a difference. Meal and beverage temperature, some people say this might have an effect, but for the most part, yeah, as far as I can find, this does not seem to have an effect. But we do know that when you're exercising, and when it's hot, people like cold drink. Okay, that also promotes drinking, more drinking. You know, when you drink, when you're running really hard and marathon, whatever, outside it's hot, sweating, and here comes a boiling hot Gatorade versus ice cold Gatorade. I mean, I think I can bet that 100% of the people would go for ice cold a Gatorade, unless you're from like Taiwan or China or something, where um, drinking warm drink is considered a healthy thing, and then cold drink is considered an unhealthy thing. So, but that's just kind of cultural difference. Anyway, um, the temperature does not seem to make a difference, but people prefer a colder temperature when it's a drink. And then you have psychological stress. So when you are more nervous, so when your sympathetic nervous system is more turned on, you're nervous, you're exercising, all these things, that slows down gastric emptying rate. Okay. Um, so, well, I'm sorry, that was my office phone ringing. Had to answer real quick. Anyway, getting back to this, so psychological stress. When you're stressed out, when you're nervous, that slows down the gastric emptying rate. It also slows down the digestion itself as well. When you're relaxed, you can actually speed up the digestion. So, uh, something that you have to consider, like you might need some energy, you might need to eat something, but it's before competition and you're a little nervous because you want to compete well and all that stuff, then you may not necessarily be the best thing to eat um, right before. Maybe if you're gonna eat, if you're a person that gets nervous, then that's something that is easy to digest, like water with or a Gatorade, or low in caloric density, um, and a fast digesting. Um, it's nothing of fat or fiber or protein. So anyway, that's just the considerations when you plan a meal. Other things, a dehydration and a hypothermia can also reduce gastric emptying rate. Women generally have a slower gastric emptying rate. Now again, there's a variability, so I can't quite say by how much, but tends to have slower gastric emptying rate. So if you're a coach working with female athletes, that's something that you need to know. You should plan ahead. And sport nutrition, if I haven't mentioned, is something that you definitely should practice in training or in practice before you go to a competition. Um, I just it just helps so much. Um, you can avoid unnecessary discomfort of the stomach and digestive tract. That if you know what happens ahead of time, if you have practiced it. And so also there's this large inter-individual liability in this. Some individuals can empty 70 to 80% of the solution in 15 minutes, while others can only empty 20 to 30% of the same solution in 15 minutes. So what makes it so different? Who knows? It's no food. What makes someone so much stronger, and what makes someone so much faster, and what makes someone so much better in endurance events, and probably the genetics. And so there's huge variability in humans. So again, this suggests that you need to kind of experiment before you actually try some kind of strategy uh, in a competition. Okay, a little bit more about a carbohydrate. We talked about gastric emptying rate, glycemic index. Now, in terms of carbohydrates for this lecture, here's just one thing that you need to know: rapid versus slow carbohydrates. CHO again stands for carbohydrate. Okay, this is probably worth kind of getting into a meat and potatoes of sport nutrition a little bit. Um, and so there are times where you want fast digesting, fast absorbing carbohydrate because you really want energy right now, like you're running a marathon, and or you're playing soccer. It's the second half, or you're about to begin the second half. You had a really hard first half, and you need energy. You want glycogen, you want liver glycogen, you want more glucose, so you have energy to actually perform better. And so when it's the case, you want to take in rapid carbohydrates, so glucose, sucrose, maltose, maltodextrins, amylopectin. Okay, these are fast delivered carbohydrates. Okay, usually you can get some like a glucose and maltose or maltodextrins. Okay, these are typically available easily. Sucrose. Okay, also. And slow carbohydrate fructose. We talked about galactose, isomaltulose, trehalose, and amylose. Okay, so these are ones just to remember, and we'll talk about what kind of food that you want to eat. And if you really want to know what food really contains these carbohydrates, go back to the glycemic index tables. Okay, and they tell you basically these correspond to high glycemic index food versus low glycemic index food. Okay, so that's basically what you're looking for. But just remember that, okay? And then the reason the glucose and the fructose are in red is because these are something that we will discuss in a little more detail when we go to recommendations and suggestions. So I think this is the last slide. Is the effects on hormones. So carbohydrate has effects on hormones. Actually, all many nutrients do, not all, but many nutrients do. But carbohydrates has a significant effect on hormones. The hormone that carbohydrate has an effect on is called insulin. We talked about this, right? During hypoglycemia, okay, reactive hypoglycemia. So when you eat carbohydrates, if you have a lot of glucose flowing around, it's actually harmful to the body tissues. And if it's not harmful, nobody's concerned with diabetic mellitus, but people are because it actually causes a lot of problems. So your body needs to actually clear that up into the cells, so it's not floating in the bloodstream. So the body's way of doing that is the secretion of insulin. Okay, another way is to exercise, but you know, not many people actually exercise. So if they're not, or if the body can't guarantee that you're going to exercise. So what happens is that your body secretes insulin. And insulin is a very important hormone in sport nutrition, especially in training. Okay, because it is, and in recovery too, by the way, it is a very strong anabolic hormone. Okay, anabolic means that building tissues. And so when you hear that, you might think of, oh, muscle. Yes, you actually build muscles, but it's not just the muscle. It actually repairs micro damage. It actually builds enzymes. Okay, it actually builds connective tissues and a lot of things. Okay, so it is a generic hormone that has the signal that conveys the message of building. So when your muscle cells receive insulin, detect insulin. Insulin is a little molecule, and that binds to your muscle cell membranes. There's a certain receptor on the membrane. It binds to it and sends a signal inside the muscle cells, telling the muscle cells to build up. Okay, let's build more enzymes. Let's build more mitochondria. Let's build more muscles. Let's repair this. That's what it does. But also, it tells the body to store fat, and so you want to be a little careful with that because if you eat a lot of carbohydrate with a lot of calories, right? So many calories with carbohydrate, what happens is that your body goes like, okay, a lot of insulin, a lot of calories, let's store a lot of fat. Okay, so that's one way to actually get fat, get obese, get overweight, and that's not necessarily a good thing, and you don't necessarily want to do that from a sport performance standpoint. We will talk a little bit more about body composition, how to lose weight, all these things in a later lecture. But just remember that insulin is a great hormone, but again, too much of a good thing is never a good thing. So, but anyway, elevated insulin also during exercise can reduce the catabolic effect of cortisol. So when you exercise, there's a hormone also called cortisol. Okay, exercise is the stimulus of the secretion of cortisol. It's not a glucose, but cortisol um, is reduced when there is insulin. Insulin actually has also an effect on cortisol and says like cortisol just don't come out of here, just back off and get back to your home, just don't come out here. So that's what insulin says. So when you have a lot of insulin, you can reduce the cortisol, and cortisol basically has the effect of breaking down. It's like the opposite of insulin. Okay? So cortisol floats around. It's not the exact opposite of cortisol, but in certain effects, it's the opposite of insulin. So cortisol floats around and say, hey, let's break down fat, let's break down muscles, let's break down all these things, and so we have more free resources available for us to do other things. And so maybe if you're lifting weights, that may not necessarily be the best thing you want. You want to spare as much muscle as possible. Now, the effect of this is really probably really small, and whether or not this is beneficial has been debated for a little while in the research literature. But it's just an idea that's out there, so maybe just throw it out there so you're aware of this.